Hi, I hope you're having a great day. I'm Sequin, and today we're going to be taking a look at a research project for Dr. Langston's Microeconomic Principles. Let's talk about everyone's favorite buzzword, inflation. Specifically, we'll discuss the history of inflation in the U.S. and what we can expect to see in the coming years. Before we discuss inflation, we need to cover something very important. What exactly is inflation? What does that mean, and how do we measure it? Inflation changes a lot. It fluctuates alongside our nation's gross domestic product. Specifically, it's defined as the percentage change in product and service prices from one year to the next. Frequently, when you hear inflation, you also hear terms like PCE, Personal Consumption Expenditures, and CPI, Consumer Price Index. PCE is most commonly used by the Federal Open Market Committee. CPI is used by international agencies and also the U.S. Department of Agriculture, oddly enough. In this presentation, we'll mostly look at inflation through the terms of CPI, as this is a little easier to find. During this presentation, it's important to remember that there are positives to inflation. Those who are saving or are retired do find that their dollar doesn't stretch as far, but it does benefit those in the workforce and those in debt. Workers find it easier to request raises, and those in debt find that, as the actual debt number has stayed the same, they now have more money to pay those off. With all this in mind, what interesting things happened to our economy in the last 100 years, and where is it headed? Because this is nearly 100 years of history, it just isn't feasible to touch every subject that ever affected our economy. For you, I've curated the following points from each decade so that we can get a small understanding of what people were going through. The 30s. Although not technically the 30s, in 1929 the stock market crashed. As we know, this started the Great Depression. We also encountered the Dust Bowl, so it was no surprise that our national debt increased. When we look at the CPI for that decade, we started with negative 6.4%, which would go as low as negative 10.3% in 1932. Its highest was 3.0% in 1935, and at the end of the decade it was 0.0%. The 40s. With the 40s came the end of the Great Depression and also war. Pearl Harbor gets bombed, a lot of our money goes into defense, and there are budget cuts. But most notable is Bretton Woods, a meeting in 1944 to implement an equal exchange rate between many nations. Remember that, as we'll come back to it later. We started the decade with a CPI of 0.7%, which rose to its highest in 1946 to 18.1%, and at the end of the decade, in 1949, it was its lowest at negative 2.1%. The 50s. It's 1950, World War II ended 5 years ago, and now we have the Korean War. Also, there was a recession, and the tax rates went up, but at least the Dow went back to normal. In 1950, our CPI was 5.9%, which rose to 6% in 1951. It dropped to 0.4% in 1954, and we ended the decade with a CPI of 1.7%. The 60s. Kind of. We're going to split this into two parts, and you'll understand why very soon. In the early 60s, there was a recession. Inflation fluctuated between 0.0% and 2.0% from 1960 to 1964, 1965 to 1982. Nearly as devastating as the Great Depression, this period is known as the Great Inflation. There is just so much to unpack about this. Let's start with the Employment Act of 1946. The goal was to increase employment, production, and the value of our money. The question was, how do we make this happen? Who remembers the Phillips curve? It's a neat little thing tying higher inflation to lower unemployment rates. It was only about a paragraph long in Chapter 1, so no shame if you forgot. I thought it was pretty neat. So did the government in the 60s because they implemented the Keynesian stabilization policy to try to get things back into shape. Basically, they decided if they raised inflation, unemployment would drop. The problem is, this is temporary. For it to work long term, you'd have to constantly increase inflation until even that stopped working. Two economists, Edmund Phelps and Milton Friedman, recognized this, but were ignored. They were right. As inflation skyrocketed, so did the amount of money we printed. When we were well anchored to the gold standard, we would have stopped. But we were much less tied to gold and more tied to the Bretton Woods Agreement. Told you we'd come back to it. We were trying to keep our money of equal value to a lot of other countries, and that's really hard to do, especially when we keep printing more. We collapsed Bretton Woods, and then we were tied to nothing. Literally nothing. All in all, this was a total failure, and the government finally accepted that. The problem was, it wasn't that simple to fix. Nixon used wage and price controls. This slowed prices, but also made the shortages worse for things like food. Ford declared inflation public enemy number one and started the Whip Inflation Now program. It didn't work. By the late 1970s, inflation was high and so was unemployment. The whole thing was just miserable. Fighting one problem only made the other worse. They had no idea how to fix this. In 1972, Paul Volcker took over as chairman for the Federal Reserve Board. Everyone just gave him a quick thank you because Volcker had a very different idea. He targeted the reserve itself. With the growth of the reserve being monitored and slowed, the value of money stopped decreasing quite as rapidly. It wasn't perfect. Interest rates fluctuated, lending fell, unemployment rose, and there were 2 short recessions. But it worked. Although worse for wear, the Great Inflation was over. During that time, both inflation and unemployment took a hit. We started with a 1% inflation rate and a 5% unemployment rate in 1964. Just a decade later, those numbers were 12% and 7% respectively, and by 1980, that was 14.5% and 7.5%. Obviously, it was a colossal failure. In 1965, the CPI was 1.9%, the lowest it would be until the Great Inflation ended. At the end of the Great Inflation, it was 3.3% in 1982. The highest yearly CPI was 13.3%, but it is worth mentioning that this rose as high as 14.8% in March of 1980. Also, there was another war, this time in Vietnam in 1965. The rest of the 80s. On one random day in 1987, the stock market crashed by 20%. This is the black market crash. In 1989, there was the S&L crisis, where there was way too much lending happening. And much gentler than the years prior, the CPI fluctuated between 1.0% and 5.0% between 1983 and 1989. The 90s. In 1992, they drafted the North American Free Trade Act, which removed tariffs on imports in North America. In 1993, the income tax rate changed due to the Balanced Budget Act. The long-term capital management crisis occurred in 1998. A bunch of hedge funds nearly defaulted on their loans. And in 1999, the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed as it was considered too restrictive on banks. All in all, we started with a CPI of 6.1% in 1990, the highest it would be that decade, dropped to 1.6% in 1998, and at the end of the decade, it was 2.7%. The 2000s. After 9/11, we have the War on Terror. In 2003, they lowered the tax rate on corporate dividends through the Jobs and Growth Tax Relief Reconciliation Act. Katrina hit in 2005, and the American Recovery and Reinstatement Act was put into place in 2009. It was aimed to modernize the power grid and stabilize the economy. We started with a CPI of 3.4%, which rose to 4.1%. It dropped to 0.1% in 2008, and at the end of the decade, it was 2.7%. The 2010s. In 2010, the Affordable Care Act took effect. Also, there was the Dodd-Frank Act, which aimed to increase corporation transparency and end bailouts. In 2013, the government shut down and there were spending cuts. And in 2015, the oil prices dropped. We started with a CPI of 1.5%, which rose to 3.0% in 2011. It dropped to its lowest at 0.7% in 2015, and we ended with a CPI of 2.3%. 2020. Yes, the year of COVID. 2021, and the rest of the year. People bought everything, and then hardly anything. $2.2 trillion was given to aid those struggling to work and encourage spending. We came in with a CPI of 2.5% this year. Listed here are the CPIs of some common goods and services that we spend our money on each year. At this time, we expect our CPI to come between 2.2% and 5.5%. The future. The markets are stabilizing, especially in things like food. 2022 is expected to have a CPI of 1.8%, 2023 a CPI of 2.0%, and 2024 a CPI of 2.3%. It seems that the people are ready to shop. Will the economy be ready for the people? I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. If you'd like to take a closer look at anything we talked about, here are all of those resources that I used. Feel free to pause and write any of these down. Have a great day!